When you read the passage from Matthew before us this morning, there are two obvious ways we might travel. We could look at what it might mean to be the light for the world. We're still in the season of Epiphany, and the good people on the lectionary committee were probably thinking that this would be a good passage for this season because light is a predominant symbol for Epiphany, going all the way back to the star that guided the Magi to the infant Jesus. But then there's the other possible travel route. You are like salt for everyone on earth. Comparing people to salt seems a little odd. This time of year, we think of salt as something that may have to be scattered to prevent slips and falls, though to be honest, we're saving quite a bit of money on such salt. Thanks, global warming. Salt seems like such a common thing. A pound of salt costs about $1. There's probably more change in our couches than it would cost to buy a pound of salt. So what could Jesus have had in mind in speaking of us as salt for everyone on earth? We're moving on. Anyone who has ever been on a reduced sodium diet will tell you that there is no real substitute for salt. When my mother-in-law was at the Cleveland Clinic following heart surgery, she was placed on a low-sodium diet, and each meal would come with a little packet of Mrs. Dash on her tray. She finally got to the point where she took the Mrs. Dash off the tray, handed it back to the nurse, and said, "I don't know how she stays in business." Now, with all due respect to Mrs. Dash and her posse that travels with her, you can attempt to fool yourself into believing that there is a substitute for salt, but there really isn't. My grandmother, then nearing her 90s, was placed on a sodium-restricted diet because of congestive heart failure. She no longer lived on her own and would spend a couple of weeks with each of her 3 daughters. When she was with my aunts, who were sticklers for keeping her on her diet, she didn't get to have salt. When she came to my house, my mother allowed her to cheat a little. It was August, and we were eating outside on the picnic table. Central to the meal was fresh corn on the cob. Our picnic table salt and pepper shakers were from a certain plastic kitchen party company that begins with a T, and came with little lids that covered the holes on top of the shakers. Grammy's eyes were not what they had once been, and without removing the lid, she gave that salt shaker a stern working out, tasted her corn, and said, "That tastes so much better with salt." In truth, there was not a single grain that had touched her corn, but the very memory of salt was enough. Tastes create strong memories. All of this talk about salt may have you remembering the flavor of salt. Too much salt in food is nearly impossible to remove. Too little salt in the food has us reaching for the shaker. Salt can change food from bland to delectable. This is a do-it-yourself sermon. Are you writing yours? The taste of salt changes the flavor of our food. Jesus calls us to be salt for everyone on earth. What does that mean to you? Another property of salt that we readily don't think about in these days is its power to preserve food. In New England, one of the ways the early settlers preserved fish was to salt it, the famous Massachusetts salt cod. The moisture is drawn out of the fish, and it preserves the fish until it is rehydrated in water. Go across the river, and Kentucky country ham is for the most part salt cured. This time of year, fresh hams are rubbed, even packed in salt, and then they are hung up to dry until they're ready for use later in the year. I was watching a television show about the Lewis and Clark expedition. One of the things they took with them on their journey were the necessary kettles for making salt. When they reached the Oregon coast, one of the things they did was to make salt for the journey back to the Missouri River, where they had cached their supplies for the remainder of their return trip. The men wanted salt for flavoring, but they also used it to preserve food for the journey. Did I get that right? I got experts. I got to be careful when I start going into history. So important was the preserving power of salt that in the Roman Empire, common laborers and soldiers were paid in salt, in Latin, sal. It is from that word and that tradition that we get the word salary. Earning a salary is earning one's salt and the possibility of survival. The preserving power of salt. Are you still working on your sermon? Salt can act as a preserving agent. Jesus calls us salt for everyone on earth. What does that mean to you? Now, there's one that Jesus might not have known about, considering it falls under the category of modern medical science. According to the Mayo Clinic website, hyponatremia is a condition that occurs when the level of sodium in your blood is abnormally low. Sodium is an electrolyte, and it helps regulate the amount of water that's in and around your cells. And when your sodium level drops to a low level, you might see symptoms such as headache, nausea, tiredness, muscle spasms, even seizures. But there are two more. Low sodium can affect the brain and the processes of the brain. It can cause you to enter into deep confusion, irrational fear, and heightened anxiety. Low sodium can make you feel and act as though you are no longer in control of your mental capacities. And, if left untreated, low sodium can result in death. The human body has a certain need for a certain amount of sodium, salt. Without it, the body is disabled and can even die. You still working on your sermon? Salt is needed for the proper maintenance of the body. Jesus calls us salt for everyone on earth. What does that mean to you? Time to put it all together. Jesus said, "You are like salt for everyone on earth." Now, there's one thing I should tell you. When Jesus said you, he was not using the singular. He was using the plural. We might say, y'all are like salt for everyone on earth. Or as one of my seriously Southern friends says, all y'all are like salt for everyone on earth. Jesus calls those who would be his disciples, the community of faith, to be like salt for everyone on earth. That means God's people, the church in our case, are called to season the earth with the flavor of God's love, justice, peace, and joy. When the world loses its taste for kindness, consideration, and compassion, you and I are called to shake a little of God's flavoring around and bring out the flavors God intends the earth and its peoples to have. It means that when the world around us is spoiling, messing up, and going rotten, you and I are called to be God's salt that will preserve what is of God and allow what is not of God to decay and be gone. You and I, first and foremost, as followers of Jesus Christ, must be committed to doing God's will even when it puts us at odds with others who would demand our loyalties and allegiances. When the world around us begins to show signs of decay and corrosion, you and I are called to liberally apply the salt that is love, the compassion, the justice, and the integrity that are hallmarks of the kingdom of God. And if we should fail to do that, the world may experience hyponatremia, low sodium, a lack of salt. Without the saltiness of God's people, that is, the vital and life-giving witness to God's love for all people, God's grace and mercy that allows for new beginnings, and the admonition that love for God and love for neighbor are the heartbeat of true and authentic faith, without that saltiness, the world can suffer spasms, seizures, and cognitive disability that for all the world looks and acts like insanity. That is to say, when the world seems like it is going off the deep end and you're looking for something or someone to blame, be sure to check the level of salt in the system. When the people of God withhold their saltiness, the world can respond in strange and disturbing ways. So consider this a call to high sodium living. Be salt. Salt for everyone on earth. Season the earth's people with the essence of God. Preserve the earth's people by working for justice and living righteously. And when the world starts acting a little abnormally, increase your saltiness until the sodium level rises and the world returns to its right mind. High sodium living, for now and evermore. Amen.